Great, good morning and welcome. I'm Dan Markey, and I'm the Academic Director of the Global Policy Program here at SAIS. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? Is the mic working? Good. And today it's a real pleasure to be able to welcome you to our event on the state of politics in India. Now, today also marks the official launch of the Foreign Policy Institute's report entitled Governance and Accountability in India, a comparative analysis and recommended ways forward, right here. I think there were copies out front, so you could pick one up. Now, this marks a really exciting milestone for us because the report is the first publication authored by Global Policy Program students here at SAIS. And in 2016, the authors capped their studies at SAIS with several months of research, including a short trip to India. And today marks the culmination of their intensive effort. We also have two excellent scholars who have joined us this morning to give their feedback on the report and to provide their own insights on related topics of governance in India. They'll engage in a conversation with our student authors and then open it up for questions. Now, an academic study is never a singular effort, and there are a few people who I want to thank for making this one possible. So first, a big thank you goes to SAIS's Foreign Policy Institute, and especially to Director Carla Freeman, right up here up front, and also to Associate Director Christine Kunkel, who is not here, correct? I haven't seen her. Okay. Well, thank you to you both. The FPI sponsored this publication and worked with our students on the revisions. And it's really been an honor for our program to partner with Foreign Policy Institute, and I hope we have a lot more opportunities to do similar things again in the future. Second, I'd like to thank Dr. Allison Berlin. Is Allison here? Allison will be here. She said she was going to be here, but I'd like to thank her even if she's not here yet, because she co-taught the course from which this report emerged. And the students and the entire program benefited from her expertise, and she deserves a lot of credit for making this work in India possible. Third, I'd like to thank Noah and Prama, they're standing in the back, for helping to arrange this event today. And it's never easy to bring together a group of very, very busy people at the same place, at the same time, and sometimes I wondered if it was really going to happen, and it has, despite the weather. So thanks to all of you for braving the elements and coming here today. The elements DC style, I should add. Last but not least, I want to thank our students and our authors. I know that all of you have been extremely busy with your jobs, also with families and growing families, two of you. And so ever since your graduation in May, you've still been putting in the time and effort to revise this report and turn your original report into a publication that we could release here. So thank you and congratulations to all of you. What I want to do now is, I know that all of you should have printouts with bios of our panelists, but let me at least give a quick introduction to each of them before we open things up. So first we have Devin Burks-Raybuck. Devin is right here in the front row. She's an international development professional with 8 years of experience in program management and new business development. We next have Wang Guan right here. Guan is a chief political correspondent and anchor at CCTV America. We have Shauna Marvel to his left, who is a program development consultant and former deputy director of business development at Social Impact. Rebecca Zilberman, up here in the front row, is a development manager at IREX in DC. And Robin Oates, who unfortunately couldn't be with us here today, she's not in town, but she co-authored the report, and she's a program finance specialist at UN Women in New York City. Now, as I mentioned before, we're fortunate to have two scholars who will join our panel this morning. First, to the far right is Dr. Bilal Baloch, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for the Advanced Study of India, the University of Pennsylvania, where he focuses on the political economy of government behavior in India and other developing democracies. He's also a lecturer and regional director for South Asia and the Middle East at the Lauder Institute at the Wharton School. He is currently revising his doctoral dissertation. It's entitled Crisis, Credibility, and Corruption: How Ideas and Institutions Shape Government Behavior in India. He's turning that into a monograph. Bilal has presented his work at scholarly conferences, and his commentary has been published widely. Now, Bilal also has a special connection to SAIS, which I can't help but point out, because prior to his doctoral studies, he was the chief of staff to our dean here, Dean Vali Nasser, and worked closely with him. He did his undergraduate studies at LSE, his MA at Fletcher, and his doctorate at Oxford. And last, and certainly not least, to Bilal's left is Dr. Irfan Nuruddin, who is the Hamad bin Khalifa Professor of Indian Politics, the faculty chair of the Walsh School of the Foreign Service at Georgetown, and the director of the Georgetown University India Initiative. So he's a busy man, and we're very happy to have him. Dr. Nuruddin specializes in the study of comparative economic development and policymaking, democratization and democratic institutions, and international institutions. He's the author of Elections in Hard Times, Building Stronger Democracies in the 21st Century, which was published by Cambridge in 2016, and Coalition Politics and Economic Development, Credibility and the Strength of Weak Governments, which was also published by Cambridge in 2011, among many other publications. So thanks to all of our panelists for joining us. What I'll do now is I'll turn it over to Devin, who will kick things off. Thanks again for coming.
Use this. All right, thanks, Dan, and thank you so much, Bilal and Irfan, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. We really appreciate it, and we really look forward to the discussion. As Dan mentioned, the Global Policy Program at SAIS completed a capstone project last year, I guess November 2016. Each group of students was assigned a client from the Indian government, civil society, or private sector to collaborate with on a report aimed at tackling a major policy challenge. We also traveled to New Delhi to meet with our clients in person, validate our desk research, and speak with experts on the ground. Our cohort spent several months working on parliamentary reform, specifically how international best practices can inform Indian Parliament. I'll be introducing the project and speaking about one of the key themes, and then handing it over to Rebecca, who will present the remaining findings from our research, as well as recommendations specific to our client, who is the Parliamentary Research Service of India. The Parliamentary Research Service, or PRS, is an independent, non-governmental organization set up in the model of the American Congressional Research Service and founded in 2005. It has two main functions. First, it provides research services to members of Parliament, or MPs, such as analysis of bills for consideration. Second, it provides transparency services for citizens, such as MP performance tracking. They're nonpartisan and not focused on advocacy, except when related to issues of institutional performance. So most broadly, their role is to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of Indian Parliament. So in our research, we found that there are several key issues in Indian Parliament that impact its effectiveness. These include frequent disruptions, significant fragmentation of political parties, which draws time away from productive debate and discussion, issues related to qualifications, incentives, and effectiveness of MPs to each play their own individual roles, and a lack of accountability mechanisms, such as not having recorded votes for Parliament sessions. So in looking at this, the research questions that we investigated focused on two main sub-questions. First, what are the internal and external drivers of these issues in Parliament? And second, how can international best practices inform Indian Parliament to become more effective, engaged, and representative? So we found that there are several parliamentary rules and procedures that directly affect the performance of the lower house, the Lok Sabha. Chief among these is the anti-defection law, which mandates that the members of Parliament must vote along party lines. This law was implemented to protect the government from instability due to shifting alliances. And many also believe that voting against one's party is incompatible with democracy, as MPs are elected to a specific party platform. However, party leaders use this anti-defection law to increase their control of their members, and also punish those who hold alternative views. Not only does this suppress debate, but it also prevents individual MPs from voting with the best interest of their specific constituencies. So although reasonable cases have been made from both perspectives, we do not believe that the anti-defection law actually is fostering legitimate dissent, but it's rather affording party leaders a disproportionate amount of influence and control over each individual MP. So a second issue is that the process of passing a bill hinges on the approval of the Speaker of the House. This creates a potential for bottlenecks and as well as excessive procedural influence. And thirdly, in India, each MP represents the highest number of citizens per capita than any other parliament in the world. So to put that in perspective, the global average is one MP for every 146,000 citizens. In India, each MP represents 1.5 million citizens. And worse, perhaps, is that Indian Parliament actually has the lowest budget per capita than any other in the world. The global average cost of a national parliament is just under $6 per capita, whereas India's cost per capita is a meager 25 cents. With such limited resources, MPs therefore lack the capacity to fully research key issues, or interact adequately with their constituents due to lack of funds for travel. Lastly, votes by MPs during Parliament sessions are not recorded. The lack of voting transparency means within Parliament that MPs are unable to be held accountable to by their constituencies or to opposition parties. Through comparative research of best practices from parliaments across the globe, we developed several recommendations to address some of these issues related to rules, procedures, and institutionalization within Indian Parliament. So first, we recommend that Parliament should engage in a benchmarking exercise to measure progress against agreed-upon metrics. This should also be done at routine intervals. Parliament would benefit from setting these clear standards and key performance indicators to measure both performance as well as impact over time. Second, we recommend to professionalize the committee process. In the US, Hungarian, Brazilian, and Romanian systems of government, the professionalization of committee staff is integral, not only to reviewing draft legislation, but also to keeping their public servants engaged. Allowing MPs to specialize in their areas of expertise through their committee roles will help build their skills as legislators and is likely to boost morale because they're working on issues of personal interest. Third, we recommend granting MPs additional agency outside of their own parties. They should have the opportunity to engage in the introduction of legislation, amendment process, and voting. While a repeal of or modification to the anti-defection law that I previously mentioned would be ideal, setting hours for debate without fear of party retribution would at least be a good start. Lastly, we recommend increasing the resources available to parliamentarians. In a nation, as we mentioned, that has 1.5 million people per each member of parliament, that member of parliament has a lot of work to do. So PRS is filling this gap partially with much-needed services, such as through providing a fellowship program which links fellows up with individual parliamentarians and providing custom research to MPs at their request, but greater human and financial resources are still needed. Through implementing these recommendations, we believe that Indian Parliament could increase its institutional effectiveness. I'm now going to turn it over to Rebecca, who will review our remaining key findings and recommendations.
Thank you, Devin. So I am now going to speak about the second area that we looked at, which was the role of political parties. And in doing our research, we, of course, found that political parties in India have a significant amount of impact on the effectiveness of both the Lok Sabha and the Indian Parliament broadly, as well as broader democratic engagement, which is why they merited further examination. We examined the fragmentation of political parties, how they form alliances, how they select candidates, engage with rank and file members, and how they are impacted by campaign financing. Before I get into our key findings, I'm going to speak a bit, turning what Devin's order on its head a bit and talk about some of the international cases that we analyzed with respect to political parties. So we looked at European and Israeli methods of candidate selection, where political parties adopted more inclusive and participatory methods, including party primaries and member participation in leadership selection. We also looked at the practice of model lists, which are adopted by parties in countries like Germany, Norway, and Belgium, where nominating committees consider certain variables like gender, age, and ethnicity when deciding a broader list of candidates that represent a particular constituency. And then finally, we examined political party foundations in Germany and the EU that act as intermediary organizations between political parties and the people. So our key findings are that of course, there are a significant number of political parties in India which often engage in opaque practices with respect to how they select their candidates for office. Winnability seems to be the only measure, which I think sounds familiar for a number of reasons. Mass appeal is highly valued at the expense of grooming a line of succession. In addition, political parties act as though they are above the law, as non-public governing institutions. They have a significant amount of influence inside of Parliament, but outside they claim that they are NGOs that are not subject to right to information requests. Elections in India are also expensive. It's the world's largest democracy. This is not a surprise. There is a significant amount of dark money in the system because campaign finance rules and regulations are written with a number of loopholes. And then finally, there's an advantage of indictment for MPs in the Indian Parliament. This is influenced by the relationship between the parties, as well as voter preferences, and the design of campaign finance laws. So our analysis led to 3 key recommendations. The first is adopting a 2-step candidate selection process that enables both rank and file and party leadership to vet candidates for office. Establish political party foundations to act as intermediaries between the parties, the government, and the people. They should be subject to external evaluation and Right to Information Act requests, as well as audits of their financial activities. And then finally, speaking of finance, revise campaign finance laws, including imposing disclosure and reporting requirements to curb dark money. Our third area of research focused on citizen engagement. This covers 3 areas: information, consultation, and interaction with constituents and participation of those constituents, and institutions like the media and civil society. Through our research, we found that all of these platforms exist, but they don't function optimally. So for example, as Devin mentioned earlier, MPs represent 1.5 million people and are often overwhelmed with requests from those constituents that actually do reach out to them, particularly around local government issues, because the lines of accountability at the local level are not particularly clear and tend to vary between rural and urban areas. In addition, the Indian media industry is one of the largest and oldest in the world, but it often faces criticism for being inaccurate, providing positive coverage of politicians in exchange for money, and having low representation of minority groups among journalists. Civil society organizations also drive the active participation of citizens, building government relationships and connections through reports and activism, as well as efforts to oversee and provide public services, similar to some of the efforts that PRS engages in. CSOs also play a role in civic education, as pedagogy has yet to be formalized in schools in India. With respect to our international analysis, we looked at institutions in the United States, not surprisingly, the Library of Congress, media outlets like C-SPAN, as well as advocacy organizations that track the U.S. government and the U.S. Congress, like the Center for Responsive Politics. We also looked at the European Union Parliament, particularly how it engages using social media, because it is an institution that had to build legitimacy with the public from scratch. And our third international example came from Ghana, where CSOs have taken the lead in building capacity within parliamentary committees, as their system is hindered by a severe lack of funding as well as resource constraints, similar to what Indian parliamentarians are facing. That support in Ghana includes research, legal advice, and financial backing for parliamentary committee trainings and workshops. So our analysis led to the following recommendations: increasing citizen access and engagement through clarifying parliamentary activities, making it easier for constituents to visit, and leverage other communication channels. So meet people where they are, use social media to improve information sharing and outreach, which of course leads to using technology and media to connect to citizens. For those who don't have the resources or the interest, to be honest, to visit Parliament in New Delhi, Parliament should go on the road, visiting at least one state annually, and look at models that enable citizens to engage with Parliament apolitically, for example, through cultural festivals that talk about the importance of legislative representation. And then finally, conducting regular public opinion surveys, adapting something like the Eurobarometer survey, which could provide lawmakers with a snapshot of what concerns their constituents, conducted at a state level and then debated annually in Parliament. Finally, our recommendations for the Parliamentary Research Service were as follows. So this is, of course, culmination of all of the analysis that the team did in India and our comparative studies. The first is to engage in a parliamentary needs assessment, both with parliamentarians and government stakeholders on an annual basis, to understand the issues the institution is facing and where Parliament might be receptive to suggestions. This could then inform sessions on parliamentary effectiveness. We also recommend that PRS works to strengthen the links between civil society organizations and Parliament, to better inform the development of policy and provides a means for accessing extra capacity. PRS should also create a consortia of organizations working on governance issues. Several organizations, of course, know about each other's work, and some of them complement each other, particularly with regard to those who are working to create the next generation of leaders across government. This could then enable the growth of the LAMP Fellowship Program, which Devin briefly mentioned. LAMP stands for the Legislative Assistant to Member of Parliament, and currently is focused on individual members of Parliament, but we recommend growing it to to committees as well. And then finally, recommending that PRS go on the road, host events outside of New Delhi when Parliament is out of session to reach new audiences. So with that, I will hand over to Shauna and Guan to lead us in our discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, because of our research, we were thrown in many ways into a study of India, as well as issues that relate to parliamentary effectiveness in India. Of course, some of this was new to us, and so we wanted to engage our expert panelists here whose extensive scholarship on India can inform our discussion today. So one thing that was certainly very striking to our group was that as the world's largest democracy, India has much to be proud of, but it's in a constant state of evolution, and looking forward and looking ahead, we wanted to engage with our experts to learn more about where India can go from here on the world stage. So just to start quite broadly, we put forth several recommendations. We wanted to know, based on your research, do you concur with some of our recommendations? And if so, what offers the greatest opportunity for change?
So I'll kick us off. So first of all, thank you to all the authors, Devin, Wang, Shauna, Robin, Rebecca. I think you guys have produced a fantastic report, and with such little time, I think the insights are excellent. Thank you to SAIS and to FPI and the Global Policy Program, and Dan for inviting me and being here. I've got to say, Irfan is one of my sort of intellectual heroes in the field, so it's both an honor but also quite embarrassing to be here next to him talking about India, but I'll give it a shot. So Parliament's ailments and the antidotes the report prescribes, I think, can be distilled into three broad themes, and I think they get at some of the issues that were discussed, particularly in Chapter 3 of the report with regards to anti-defection and the lack of internal democracy. The three themes I'm going to touch upon are the puzzle of state capacity, the centralization of power within political parties, and the localization of accountability. So let me briefly go through each of those three themes that I think both get at some of the points of the report, its recommendations, and some areas in which I think it'd be a good idea to think deeper if you do happen to take this report forward in your recommendations to PRS, who are doing fantastic work in India. So state capacity is one of the central questions we grapple with in political science. What is it? Where is it? Does it exist? And particularly in India, where you have such a mosaic of subnational and national regimes, it's really tough to pin it down. What I want to discuss is state capacity vis-a-vis the internal democracy within political parties. And within that, we have to think about the effectiveness of bureaucrats, especially as it relates to the implementation of policy. Now, politicians play an active, almost degradative role here through their interference in bureaucratic postings and the sidelining of meritocratic norms. And of course, bureaucrats are driving policy not just at the national level, but also at the local level, but often tend to be overworked, spread thinly across issue areas, and have to grapple with the politicization of the party of the day and their patrons, so to speak. So it's clear that further resources are needed to bulk up the offices of representatives at all levels, but I would argue also to protect bureaucrats from politically motivated postings and the overall threat to their effective functioning. But this exists side by some other factors that we've seen over the last year. The rollout of the goods and services tax and the world's largest biometric identity program with Aadhaar. So there's a puzzle in India with regards to state capacity that on the one hand, you can roll out these very sophisticated programs across, as you mentioned, over a billion people with all forms of different class configurations and regimes across the country, and that exists side by side with a real low level of state capacity on everyday policy implementations with regards to the MPs that you mentioned. And yet, when we look at the subnational level, we look at places like Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, where it's no surprise, in line with your report, that we see higher quality personnel, greater commitment and political protection for bureaucrats, and more effective state functioning. So that, I'd say, is the first thing. The second one that I mentioned is the centralization of power. Now, you mentioned the role of the Speaker of the House and MPs, but I would argue that you have to also look at the party leadership and specifically at the Prime Minister's office. Yes, the Speaker of the House does have powers that can inhibit or allow the Speaker to control parliamentary debates and therefore, but I think we have to look at how political parties are functioning on the ground empirically. So I don't necessarily think that the proliferation of parties, as you mentioned, is necessarily the issue at hand, but the trend towards centralization of power within these parties. I mean, to take one case in point, which you mentioned in the report, is the Aam Aadmi Party. So many of you that keep a close eye on India will recall the India Against Corruption movement against widespread malfeasance at the national level around 2010 onwards, and upbirthed the Aam Aadmi Party, which emerged as a single-issue party, like the Five Star Movement in Italy. But very soon, the party leadership fragmented. It came into the hands of one single politician, Arvind Kejriwal, and the single issue of being an anti-corruption party began to wane. And also, in the last year and a half, we've seen politicians join the party that are exactly the kind of sort of nefarious, unsavory characters that they were trying to rally against. So that trend towards centralization of power within parties is not just in large established programmatic parties, it exists across the board, and that's one of the key reasons I would argue with regards to some of the trends that you highlight. Now, what are the consequences of this, right? So one is the winnability factor that you mentioned, and it's increasingly included those with money and muscle. And so it's become a priority for parties to behave more and more like fiefdoms because you can bring in these individuals that independently have the money and the muscle to win elections. And the second consequence is the larger question that you're looking at, which is the reduction of debate. And so if you have strong party heads who have centralized power across parties at the regional and national level across the country, you can afford to negotiate outside of the parliamentary process. And so these are the sort of, sometimes they're Faustian bargains, and sometimes they are negotiated settlements that can have a positive influence on policy. But we see that happening outside of the parliamentary arena. And the third theme that I'd like to sort of mention is the localization of accountability. So yes, some of the trends that you're talking about at the national level do run counter to an accountable form of governance. But how do we square the fact that we see criminal politicians and so much more money and illicit funds within elections and backing politicians, together with a country that has recently turned 70 and has increasingly seen democratic norms deepen and its institutions with regards to an electoral democracy strengthen? One of the most prominent examples is that of the Election Commission and the reduction of violence around voting booths. So how we square this, I would argue, lies in the local level. So these are effectively politicians who are delivering on social services, on combating crime, and providing jobs. Now, that may not be seen straight off the bat when you look immediately at their backgrounds, but the history of people such as Y.S. Reddy in Andhra Pradesh and the most recent election of the Chief Minister of UP, the very unsavory Yogi Adityanath, is sort of testimony to this fact that nefarious behavior and linkages to unethical and degradative norms does not necessarily lead to a lack of accountability at the local level. So I'll stop that there and allow, of course, Irfan to step in. But those are the three broad themes, and then we can get into more specifics as we move on.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here this morning, and congratulations to SAIS, to Dan and Ali, I don't know if she's actually here yet. Oh, there you are, for mentoring this project, and to the authors for writing it. I'm going to resist the comment to tell Bilal that he embarrassed me, not just by being very nice, but also by reminding me how old I've become. When you're other people's intellectual heroes, that probably means that you're much older than they. So I want to sort of also provide some framing comments before we get into sort of the weeds of the questions. I want to start by giving you some basic facts, right? So a couple of times in the presentation, I think it was Rebecca, or maybe it was Devin, who mentioned the 1.5 million per MP. I mean, by my back of the envelope calculations, that number is actually closer to about 2.5 million per, right? 1.2 billion people divided by 545 is at least 2.2 billion per MP on average. It's only in a country like India that the rounding error is about 700,000 people, but that's not insignificant. This is relevant because 2.2 million people per MP, right? An average constituency then, on its own would be the 15th large, there'd be 15 US states with smaller populations than an average constituency in India, okay? 2.5 million people would be larger than the state of Nevada. If you think about what the right proportionality is of citizens per constituency, let's use England, right? That the mothership of parliamentary democracy as a sort of benchmarking exercise. If India were to have the same number of citizens per MP as the UK does, the Lok Sabha would have to have 13,000 MPs. It has 545. Right? You have to have 13,000 MPs. That would be slightly noisier and rowdier than the current Lok Sabha by at least some margin, I would imagine, right? But it gives you some sense of the scale. Why is the scale important? I think the scale is important for me because it suggests that all other examples that we would typically point to as models were created and developed in systems that are completely unlike the challenges India faces. So as a comparativist, I believe in the power of comparison. I believe in the power of learning from other things. But it also means that we have to be deeply skeptical about what lessons Norway and its parliamentary system have to offer the parliamentary system of India. Right? It means that I think we have to be deeply skeptical of virtually every other democracy that's out there right now in terms of what lessons it actually carries for a country like India, which is not to say we can't learn stuff. Right? It is to say that when we take an insight and try and turn it into a recommendation, we are likely to get ourselves in real trouble because the scope of this issue, the challenge of this issue, is deeply different. Part of that's reflected in that when we think about parliamentary democracies, we think about the national level of government, right? We think about Congress. This is a very DC problem, right? I mean, they're right down the road. We think about Congress, or we think about, Westminster, and we think about, you mentioned the EU Parliament, we think of the Knesset in Israel. We think about Parliament, we think at that level. But it's not obvious that in India, the real governance and accountability reforms that have to occur should be occurring at the Lok Sabha. Not because it couldn't use it, but simply because the challenge of doing it over there is likely to be at a scale and level that is pretty insurmountable, right? State governments, on the other hand, and maybe even more local units than that, begin to resemble the scale of the issue that is happening in other places. And in fact, state governments are far more powerful in fundamental ways where citizens are concerned than the national government. In the Indian Constitution, the state governments control the power of spending on things like education and healthcare, local infrastructure. In fact, all the things that we typically think citizens are holding their governments accountable for falls in the hands of the state government, not in the hands of the national government, right? The way when I teach my students this stuff, I say the national government gets the revenue, the state government spend that revenue, right? I mean, that's a bit simplistic, but that's effectively what it is, which means that maybe we should be focusing really at the state government level in a far more fundamental way than is being done in this report. But I think more generally, when we focus on it, it's easy to look at Lok Sabha and look at all the problems of the Lok Sabha, and we ignore the fact that most Indian citizens are far closer to their MLAs, just by scale of geography and by relevance to their daily lives than they ever will be to the member of parliament. So that's one little thing I want to put to you. The second thing I want to put to you is sort of just the state capacity issue that Bilal already invoked, right? I want to translate that actually into dollars and cents. I want to think about it in terms of actual money that governments have to spend on their citizens. I've got a dog in this race because some years ago, Pradeep Chibber and I published a paper linking what we call fiscal space, the resources available to governments, right, after they've accounted for their debt servicing, after they've accounted for paying the folks that they have to pay, the police and civil service bureaucrats, etc., for the money left over that they could actually spend on programs to serve their citizens, right? And the simple truth is that most Indian governments are on the verge of bankruptcy, right? They have virtually no resources to claim. And we've begun to see this in the context of understanding the absolutely depleted Indian tax revenues, right? India, fewer than 10% of the population works in the formal sector. Of that, about maybe 20% of those pay income taxes, resulting in an overall percentage of about 2% of the Indian population paying income taxes. Of course, a much larger percentage pay sales taxes and all of that. But the tax take for a country like India is extremely small. What happens when a system has no money to spend on things like public health, on things like education, on things like roads? Well, what happens is that you still have to run for re-election. And so the way you run for that re-election is to compete on everything other than programmatic appeals. Because anything you promise cannot be funded. You simply can't pay for it. So you run on ethnicity, you run on religion, you run on caste, you run on other sorts of appeals. You run on your personal power to be able to provide somebody a job, or to help somebody's son get into college, or to come to somebody's daughter's wedding and provide that kind of service. It is retail politics, right? It is a very discrete level politics, but it isn't programmatic politics. So I sort of chuckle when Bilal used the term programmatic parties, because with the exception of the BJP and maybe the good old CPI, right, the Communist Party of India, it's not obvious to me that there is another programmatic party operating in India, right? 1,000 parties, one program, right? And that's the BJP's program, as it were. So I want to think about those as really deep underlying issues that this report begins to touch on but doesn't actually grapple with, and suggest that unless we can get that foundation pretty strong, the other reforms, well-intentioned as they are over here, run a risk of running sort of aground of sort of the deep reality that we could weaken the power of the speaker, and we could, change the nomination process that leads to fewer criminals getting nominated and elected to parliament. They'd still get there, and they'd still have virtually no money to spend and no programmatic ability to actually deliver things. And that deeply undermines accountability. A couple of really quick thoughts before we get into the Q&A. I think the other thing I want to just sort of push on, and I do this sort of in the spirit of being, both provocative but also curmudgeonly, right, is how to think about what the challenges are that we're trying to fix in India, right? What are the challenges to governance and accountability that India actually faces, the Indian Parliament actually faces, that require fixing? India is a country in which being an incumbent is actually a disadvantage relative to being an incumbent, right? There's a massive anti-incumbency factor in an election. Electoral volatility is extremely high. That's beginning to change a little bit over the last decade, but if you look at the period from 1967 to 2010, on average, being an incumbent meant you lost the next election. Isn't that a measure of accountability? Right? Surely the most powerful thing that a voter has is the ability to throw the bums out, right? How do we contrast that with the United States, in which incumbency is a significant advantage, in which 85% of congressional candidates get reelected not just once, but over and over and over again, right? And the only vacancies that come are when people essentially retire from office. So which of those systems is more accountable than the other, right? It's not obvious to me the one in which incumbency is a very strong factor that virtually an opposition candidate has no chance of running, is the more accountable. Most US elections are effectively uncontested at the level of the general election. The real action happens at the level of the primaries, right? Is that a more accountable system than one in which people are losing elections on a regular basis? I'm not saying they aren't. I'm just saying that it forces us to clarify what we mean when we say we need more accountability in the system. Also, Milan Vaishnav is one of my closest friends and definitely one of my intellectual heroes. And his influence on this report is, palpable because of the work that he's done that has really blown the lids off a lot of people's understanding of India because of the focus on criminality and all of that. I like to josh Millen about this, right? Because I say, what exactly about the criminality bothers us? Is it that it sort of, upsets our genteel upperclassness, right? These guys seem unsavory, they don't seem quite right. What does it mean to be a criminal in a context in which filing an FIR, a first incident report, is a trivial matter in this system, in which the judicial system takes on average a decade before reaching a resolution on a basic civil or criminal case, right? Effectively, we have anecdotal evidence that these guys go out and try and get a case filed against them, right? Simply as a matter of sort of proving that they are tough, right? That they're strong, as opposed to actually being deeply problematic. So again, the criminality, the unsavoriness, I think it's worth questioning why we think this is something worth fixing in a system in which voters exercise a secret ballot and regularly throw these same people out of office, right? There is a citation here that the indicted incumbents win at a slightly higher percentage than the non-indicted incumbents, but even that's 60%, right? Most of these guys are losing the next election when they don't perform. I talk to a lot of MPs, they all are petrified about anti-incumbency, right? Believe me when I say that they for sure think that they're being held accountable by their voters, even if they then struggle to know how to build a base that will actually get them that next election. And the final thought. Germany, Romania, the United States, Israel, the EU Parliament are some of the examples that were used when you guys were presenting today. They're all very well-established consolidated democracies, all of which are suffering significant governance, accountability, and legitimacy problems of their own. Romania, like much of, unfortunately, Eastern Europe, is potentially on a spiral into deeply authoritarian tendencies, right? Corruption charges in the Israeli parliament are right? It's the one place where the Indian parliament can look and say, at least they're not that bad, right? Right, and of course then there's Congress, but given that we're about 24 hours away from a second shutdown in the last month, it's a question about what lessons on governance can be learned from this system. So I think what would be kind of cool for you guys to do, and I think would be a genuine contribution, would be to build on the sorts of examples you were using when you talked about Ghana and Kenya, right? But to look at developing country contexts in which the scope and challenges that India faces are more aligned and more akin. But I think it's about time we start thinking about India as an exemplar for democratic reform for other countries of the world, as opposed to thinking about other countries teaching India lessons. At the end of the day, for 70 years, it has survived, it has managed its democracy. And I think we might want to just flip the script intellectually to say, how about we think of this as an example of governance and accountability, and what can it teach the European Parliament? What could it teach Congress? The answer might be very little, but it might be a useful intellectual exercise. I look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much for framing and putting things in context for us. I think we also acknowledge that the issues that you've highlighted that we did not touch on our paper are quite significant and are useful in terms of looking at India in the context of the global stage and what it can teach us. Given all of these issues, and maybe even just focusing on this idea of state capacity. So for example, we had quite the honor of meeting with members of parliament during our time in New Delhi, and they did share this idea that they don't have enough resources to get things done or to focus on issues at hand. What would you both recommend as a great place to start to sort of change or move the dial on democratic behaviors and trends in India?
Oh, that's a huge question. I think you touch upon it with regards to the bandwidth afforded to ministers. And so taking that on with Irfan's point and what I mentioned about looking at sort of lower levels of abstraction, looking at the district level, looking at the state level, I think it's very clear that there are emergent trends at that more localized level of when there are better resources, better educated bureaucrats, that bureaucrats, there's a sort of historical wisdom that sometimes gets cited in a lot of the literature, which is the more local bureaucrats are, and that could also include, that doesn't just include people in offices running, file running, etc., but that also includes the police, that the more local they are, that sort of induces more corruption. But I would actually argue the opposite, and that level of local knowledge, especially when you just have, because you're not going to win that numbers game. You're not going to suddenly have thousands and thousands more representatives, thousands and hundreds of thousands more bureaucrats overnight. That's going to take a long time. But having bureaucratic capacity and empowering these bureaucrats, both especially at the local level, but also at the national level, to go forth with what they're designed to do, which is idea generation and implementation. I think that's a serious part of state capacity that currently is seriously missing.
Yes, so I would agree. I think ideas are the currency. You cited the Congressional Research Service, which is an incredible organization, an institution. But in many ways, the more powerful thing that we can learn from the American system, that India could learn from the American system, is how to think about think tanks and universities as incubators for ideas that then percolate. Much of this is about firing the imagination for how to solve the seemingly intractable problems that a country like India faces. Where do those ideas come from, right? And how do we create those ideas in a way that is sort of abstracted from politics while being sensitive to the political implementation challenges and bureaucratic implementation challenges. There are governments that are really trying very hard to do this, right? Telangana and Andhra have really done a great deal in terms of forging partnerships with Western-based academics, local institutions, to say, can you help us generate ideas? The government of Maharashtra has signed an MOU with Harvard, and in fact, Georgetown is currently in the process of finalizing an MOU as well, where we would both be, Harvard and Georgetown would be partners with the government of Maharashtra in a basically an innovation institute that would be a think tank within the government to help trial, develop and implement new ideas. Of course, local universities need to be part of that, and there need to be local implementation partners as well. But I think we need to generate new ideas because these guys need that help. But I think we don't get around any of this unless we figure out the money part of it, right? The GST in that sense is transformative if it succeeds in delivering to the Treasury a much greater share of resources that can come back. The reason these guys feel so strapped is because they're doing constituency service to 2.5 million people, right? They're not strapped because in Parliament there's very little that can get done that is meaningful at the legislative level. So their days are full of meeting person after person who's coming to petition them for a favor, to help them with this, to help them with that, right? It's like having never-ending office hours as a professor. Right? We love the students, but man, at some point you want them to go away, right? So you can read a book, you can write something, right? This is nonstop. I asked one of these politicians once, I said, where do you need money? They said, when these people come to my constituency office, I am obliged to feed them, to house them, because they have traveled from their local village all the way over here, right? And part of what I have to demonstrate is the ability to take care of them. Right? That's where the money is needed. In fact, it was implicitly, that's why I might take a bribe. I might do this stuff because I have to pay it back out to my constituents in this very sort of retail kind of way. I think unless the legislature becomes a place in which actual ideas are being generated and implemented, you don't have that. Take the budget that was announced a couple of days ago, right? The finance minister announces a universal health care policy, right? Transformative potentially, and allocates to it 2,000 crore rupees, or about $311 million. $311 million for universal healthcare to cover 500 million plus people, right? Just poor and vulnerable, right? I mean, SAIS and Georgetown wouldn't accept an endowed building for $311 million, right? Let alone talk about providing universal healthcare to 500 million people. And I'm willing to bet, right? You can put it on the record right now, that's a scheme that probably will not actually get funded. Right? In 2016's budget, there was also a healthcare plan announced that never ever got funded by the same thing. And these guys have a majority in parliament. Right? This is not a knock against the government. It is just an admission of how structural it is. So I actually think we need public finance to be at the core of how we think about governance and accountability reforms. It's boring, right? It's maybe the stuff we leave to the economists and the tax people, but it's centrally a political economy question that we have to grapple with.
Thank you, gentlemen. I echo Shauna's comment in that we're certainly enlightened by what's missing in this report, especially at local levels, how things are being done at this point in time. Some of the issues, if we just focus on Lok Sabha, some of the more salient issues that we investigated include the efficiency of legislation. Irfan, you just mentioned very little get done, actually. The disruptions during the 15th Lok Sabha was a staggering 40% time lost due to disruptions. If you look at the sittings, the time of sittings, duration of it is on the downward trajectory. Another more salient issue is anti-defection law, a law that is pretty rare in established democracies in Western Europe and North America. But India still has it. Where do things stand now as when it comes to those two issues?
Yeah.
So I have somewhat of a contrary take on the disruptions aspect. I think that is detrimental to a parliamentary democracy for sure. And there is a sense in which, and there are numbers to prove this, that the hours spent in Parliament have been reduced, that the hours spent debating on a particular policy have increased, and in short, not much is getting done. But I don't think that that's necessarily a reflection of the efficacy of policy going through. The theatre of Parliament and debate, I think we've seen change in the negative quite a bit, not just in India, but in other places too. I mean, you just have to switch on the TV to the House of Commons or Congress here, and in India too. And therein might lie a cue, which is how we telecast these debates have sort of gone hand in hand with further grandstanding or filibustering, as you see here. So I think there is a theatre element to it, but I'm not necessarily sure that goes hand in hand with politicians in the parliamentary context sort of debating and agreeing upon policy. Because, and as you all mentioned in your report quite rightly, this notion of committees. Right, so in my own work, I'm turning my dissertation into a book, and that it essentially makes an argument about a team of rivals and the idea of ideas in the committee setup. And I think there is ample evidence, and certainly the period that I look at, which is the UPA government, which sort of went out of office in 2014, that when you have differing ideas and ideas around policy on these committees, you are seeing a sort of more salient and better debated move towards policy generation. Now, is it visible? No. And does it need to be? Perhaps so. But I think it's important to sort of disaggregate what we mean by the parliamentary functions of debate and argumentation, because what necessarily meets the eye may not be a true reflection of the policy outcome.
Yeah, the ADL, I mean, so the disruption, I also think we kind of, it's funny that we worry so much about disruptions, right? If I had a chance to punch some of these guys, I'd probably want to take it as well. So it's like, right, I mean, the notion that the parliament gets disrupted, the question is what would they be doing with their time if they weren't being disrupted, right? And the answer is probably not a whole lot. So I think it's one of those visible indicators that sort of is cringeworthy, right? It's like it just looks unseemly. It looks, the lack of decorum is embarrassing. But parliaments are strange things, right? You go to if you walk down to Congress right now, I mean, there'll be somebody reading into the record to an empty hall, right? In which, and so there's no disruption over there. But that seems kind of strange and rude in its own right? I mean, so this notion of the picture in our head of the House of Lords or the House of Commons, in which people are on both sides and there's someone speaking, and I mean, that's a very stylized sort of idea. Most modern parliaments don't function quite like that. The ADL, though, is someone I think worth talking about. Look, there are two things that happened effectively between 1985 and 1995, right? The ADL is passed, the anti-defection law, and then there's significant party fragmentation, right? These are, in fact, at least one scholar has linked these as cause and effect, that when people realize that they could not, let's call it vote to your conscience kind of idea, right? I mean, they go and form their own parties. So the proliferation of parties could be thought of as an escape valve from anti-defection, right? The proliferation of parties is itself an interesting phenomenon, right? Because one of the other things that happens in the early 1990s is that the Indian government passes significant, almost actually positively transformative decentralization amendments to the Indian Constitution, lowering and empowering the lowest level of the Indian system, the panchayat system, with actual resources and all of that. If you think historically, right, and Pradeep Chibber and Ken Coleman have this wonderful book called The Formation of National Party Systems, looking at the United States, the UK, Canada, and India, and how it is that party systems began to, how did we come to have just two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, effectively as the choice? And the answer historically is that it changes as the level at which fiscal centralization is occurring rises to the federal government. As the federal government becomes a place that has a real fiscal power compared to state governments, having party labels that were relevant at the national level become more crucial in the United States. In India, in which the state governments are the fiscally powerful area, it stands to reason that state-level parties make more sense, right? That's the label that matters the most. But once you decentralize and you have local level, you actually force a downward pressure on where the party label is most relevant. Put simply and without jargon, if really what matters is controlling the purse strings in Maharashtra, I need a party that's relevant in Maharashtra. It's irrelevant whether they're also powerful in Kerala. It's irrelevant whether they're also powerful in Odisha, right? So we get these state-level sort of parties. Okay. Anti-defection made it hard for these guys to vote. You use this phrase that I'm not sure I agree with at all. You said, in ways that are not in the best interest of their constituency. Well, it's not clear what is in the interest of their constituency. And actually, if you think about accountability, the party label is a very powerful signal of what we think our representative should be doing. And if she's not voting along with the rest of the party, but I voted for the Congress party, and here's my representative siding with the BJP, surely that's a very powerful signal to me that they are not working in my interest, right? And that the anti-defection law, in fact, prevents individual MPs from substituting their judgment for what is the collective judgment of the party. So it's not clear that ADL is anti-democratic or anti-accountability. In fact, you could argue that it is reinforcing, in a low information, largely illiterate society, it is reinforcing the one accountability mechanism that exists, which is I know my party label. I mean, these parties fight over symbols, the hand with 4 fingers, 3 fingers, because that's how the voters are going to recognize their parties. Party labels are crucial. And so you want to reinforce that, right? You want to do that. So I'm not sure ADL is problematic. But remember that there are three things happening. You've got ADL, decentralization, and party proliferation, all happening in the same 5 to 10 year span of time. And focusing just on ADL without paying attention to the other two might lead to undue focus on anti-defection when really the issues might be you decentralized, but we are focusing on the Lok Sabha, right? So it was almost like they did a bait and switch on us, right? Focus on parliament, but actually all the actions happening low and low.
Interesting. Did you have
Well, I think lots of the comments alluded to or mentioned the subject of comparative politics, comparative models in terms of the U.S. Parliament, the Western Parliament, and the Indian Parliament. Can I ask another question to enlarge this debate a little bit more, to compare about the Chinese model versus the Indian model? One boasts itself for being centralized authority, authoritarianism, benevolent authoritarianism, as some call it, to get things done, making long-term strategies not interrupted by election cycles every 2 or 4 years. On the other hand, the Indian model boasts itself for representation, enhanced democratic institutions, the largest in the world, also the fastest growing rate in the world right now, surpassing that of China. How do you look at those two models? Do you think those two models fit the respective country well?
A friend of mine who spoke at Georgetown a couple of days ago, Amit Ahuja, reminded me of a statistic that came out through Pew Global Research in December, which essentially said that 53% of Indians support military rule, and at least 55% of Indians back a system in which a strong leader can make decisions without interference. I think what gets at the rub of the China-Indian comparison, at least with regards to this report, is for China, democracy is not necessarily an end. I think there is the political system. Yes, it is largely authoritarian, but if we go into its sort of nooks and crannies, that there has been some fluidity to it. But I also think for the Indian system, democracy is not necessarily an end as it has been for, say, for example, the US. But I do think poverty alleviation is, and therein lie different models of actualizing how India goes about establishing those or alleviating those problems that it faces. And I think that's where a discussion about currently right now, which is quite prominent in India, and I'd argue has been for several years, the debate between state and market comes in. And it's one that also China grapples with, right? So it has more of the sort of state-led capitalism model, or the or how perhaps sort of more sympathetic Chinese scholars would talk about, helping the market along, so to speak. In India, this is a more complex debate, and I think a good one, because it wants to go hand in hand with the democratic process. And part of that is this age-old debate between sort of people like Amartya Sen on the one hand, and Arvind Panagria and others on the other, which is, does growth come first, or does the investment and establishment of what Irfan mentioned earlier on, a universal healthcare system, or investment in healthcare, investment in education? And I think that sort of gets at the different approaches to political economy in both countries. I'm not necessarily of the view that the political model is an idealized end, and that's necessarily what is being focused on.
I mean, in any debate that has Amartya Sen on one side of it, that wins. So and definitely if Arvind Panagria is the guy on the other side. For India, democracy is an article of faith. It is core to the identity. That Pew number that Bilal mentioned, that Amit cited, is one that I wouldn't trust any further than I could pick this desk up and throw it, right? Because I've done these surveys. I mean, you guys mentioned public opinion polls. India is a heavily surveyed country. I mean, we have regular national election studies. We run the State of the Nation survey. The one thing that is true of all that survey data is that in any given question of this kind, 50% of the population says, I don't know, or I do not have an opinion. Because to ask someone illiterate deep in the rural parts of India on a farm whether or not democracy or authoritarianism would be preferable is to ask him whether he'd prefer to live on Mars or Venus. That's an irrelevant question with concepts and ideas that are so far from live reality. And the only folks who I think it's fashionable to remark that they admire the Chinese model are the people sitting in apartments in Bombay and Delhi whose other passport, right, is a UK passport, an Australian passport, or an American passport, not a Chinese one, right? I mean, the immigration that they aspire for their children isn't to Beijing, it is to well-established democracies around the world. So I think over there. You asked, are they suited? I mean, I don't know what that question, what it means to be suited or not. I think, we can't rerun history and know what would have happened had China become democratic or not. I do think that the apparent success of the Chinese model is predicated on a particular commitment to certain kinds of homogeneity, whether it's linguistic or otherwise, that would have been impossible in India, right? I mean, there's a lot of people in the South right now who will point out that for all of the BJP's sort of imperial ambitions to conquer the South, no one who's ruled India has really managed to actually rule India. Even the British, at the best of it, had only 1/3 of British India was under direct rule of the British, right? That's it, because the rest of it was, not even the Mughals did it, sort of thing. So I think any effort to impose something that was more authoritarian on India would have led to a fragmentation. We'd not be talking about India, we'd be talking about 20 different countries right now. So India's democracy is what keeps that country against the odds, I think, together. But part of that is also that decentralization. So maybe that's the other thing I'd pose to the room as sort of something to chew on, which is, would a more powerful parliament, right, a more centralized legislature in Delhi actually lead to a fragmentation of the country as a whole, right? Or does the fact that the folks sitting in Delhi, as powerful as they are in fact don't have the act together, that they kind of can't do a whole lot, and as a result the state governments have power, does that maintain the federal system that is core to keeping this very diverse country together? In my book, Coalition Politics and Economic Development, I in fact argue that the era of coalition politics was critical for India's economic growth because it essentially kept the Lok Sabha from screwing it up, right? It was essentially hamstrung these guys, and they weren't able to make bad policy. They weren't able to make good policy either. But effectively, it just kept them out of the way, and it allowed the economy and the states to be innovators and go over there. That's, that doesn't quite sit with the spirit of what you guys wanted to do over here. But if you think about democracy in the way you just asked one, I would say that. I want to make sure we talk about public finance, because you talk about the financing of political parties in section 4, and I do think that is the one idea over here that needs to be thought through and worked on explicitly, because we've just passed in India, including in the last budget, Milan Vaishnav has written some very good columns in the last week about this, the ability for much more dark money to be pumped into the system. Part of that's inspired by Citizens United and the rulings in this country, right, of allowing all of that, corporate sponsorships. But I think we're about to see a significant influx of pretty unaccountable and untraceable money into the Indian political system that is critical for these parties to contest these elections, but has really deeply concerning aspects of democracy. And over there, the reforms that I think we learned from the United States are things like the transparency reforms, the sunshine laws that require the reporting of campaign contributions and all of that. There might be far more corporate money in the system than we think is a good idea, but at least we know it and we can trace it, so we can begin to do that kind of investigative journalism. The version that's happening in India lacks that transparency, right? And that could be deeply problematic. So this is happening in real time. It's actually literally in the last few months, and I think that's a really crucial insight that you guys come up with over here, is that we have to think about how parties get financed and how to clean that up, or we run a risk of really hurting the democracy.
Great. Thank you both so much for your astute commentary and thoughts for our paper. We'd like to offer this up to the audience now to build on the comments that Bilal and Irfan have presented. Coming around with the microphone.
What is the on the panel is while you've spoken about government and the legislative process and civic engagement, I think one big stakeholder group can look from this report as private sector. And policies that they deal to do with the
Sure, great, thank you. I'll start with the methodology question. So, the way we approach this is we formulated three kind of key areas that we were looking at. So, at the start of our paper, we talked about disruptions. I'll have to go through it again. I'm sorry. But largely what we used here was sort of desk research, literature reviews, and then coupled with qualitative research. So our field research was qualitative in nature, and we interviewed parliamentarians, CSOs, activist groups, those who were contributing or had a role to play, perhaps, in the issues that we looked at that we believed were possibly the root causes of inefficiencies noted in Parliament and its effectiveness. So we looked at that. Because of the scope, and we only had a week, and we were confined by our sort of research process, if you will, while we recognize the importance of private sector, we didn't have the opportunity or the time to delve as deeply into that as we would like to. However, recognizing that the private sector certainly has a role to play both in poverty alleviation as well as streamlining and making local as well as national efforts and enhancing them to help through this pronged. So we've touched on this a lot, I think, and that India was so surprising to us and how large it was in the scale. And Irfan and shared those statistics. And I think private sector has a role to play in that, but we did not get to that as in-depthly in the paper as we would have liked to.
Yeah, basically, we spent a whole semester, about 3-4 months, to do the literature review and qualitative research to develop hypotheses about the Indian Parliament, Lok Sabha, by talking to some leading experts in town, some journalists covering India, and also we visited the Indian embassy. So we make sure that before we develop some assumptions about India, those could be legitimate assumptions. Also, lots of reading.
On the private sector, that's a really interesting question. I mean, India's got a remarkably aggressive corporate social responsibility requirement. And one of the things that I think we don't really have great answers on or great research on, but it's worth asking, is how that has both supplemented a meager state capacity, but also distorted the incentives for politicians to do more, because in effect, lots of the stuff is now being done through private CSOs and the private sector. But I think in the long run, that's a good thing, right? I think all that private sector involvement is a good thing. There's a lot of public-private partnerships that are becoming more common. That is not a bad thing. In some sense, the leapfrogging of the normal way in which this develops, in which the public sector takes the first, then you get private sector. In India, it's happening simultaneously. I think the bigger challenges are how to hold the private sector accountable for this, right? How do we make sure that there are auditing standards that are up to snuff? How do we ensure best practices? Because if the politicians are dependent on the private sector actors, you can see why that breaks down. And the state versus market distinction that Bilal mentioned is pretty critical. All parties in India are state-friendly. There is no market-friendly party in India, right? Not one. Even the BJP, which is often thought of as market-friendly, is actually business-friendly as opposed to market-friendly. Its model is to pick champions, right? So the Adani group or the Ambanis or whatever, and give them privileged access to particular parts of the economy, as opposed to actually encouraging market-based reforms that generate lots of competition and that sort of thing. And so I worry a little bit about the private sector, because what we see right now is what I see right now is a lot of peak organizations getting large swaths of things that really the public sector has a particular responsibility for managing, right, to ensure that it gets to the bottom of the pyramid, that people are held accountable. And if we cede all of that to the private sector, we might never regain get it back. So I think it's a bit of a delicate balance. But there's no question that schools, hospitals, roads, ports, and airports are increasingly being built with private sector partnership, and that's got to be a good thing in the long run.
Yeah, I would add that to the CSR and the PPP endeavors that Irfan mentioned, that the private sector has been pretty deeply involved in what is this emergent zeitgeist about mobile governance and e-governance. Huge behemoths like Infosys, for example, were a critical part of the Aadhaar program that I referenced earlier on, the world's largest biometric identification system of its kind. And that has a lot of... Of course. Now, that has two benefits, right? Ex ante. One, it can save the state a lot of money. Some of the challenges that we spoke about in terms of finance, bureaucratic bandwidth, can be cut down quite significantly. And on the other hand, given the penetration of mobile phones in India, you can really give direct access, whether it's in terms of cash or even information, which is critical, to citizens. But of course, in the short to medium term, it comes riddled with challenges to do with who you're reaching, issues of privacy, cybersecurity threats, and of course, what is being done with a lot of this information. So, you know, life and humans and politics gets in the way, but I think there is another benefit to the private sector's involvement on the e-governance side.
Right. Let me just one other thought on this. In 2004, at Berkeley, there was this conference put on by an organization of Silicon Valley Indians, right, interested in India, who were deeply concerned about what they were seeing, in the way that I think often happens. And they call themselves the Foundation for Democratic Reforms in India, FDRI. And they organized this workshop at Berkeley that I was at. In fact, it's when I first met Arvind Kejriwal, who at that point was, just really up and coming, deeply impressive then, as I think he still is right now. But one of the things that was very clear to me where the private sector is concerned is that the word governance, and I say this again to my colleagues who've written this report, is one that we have to interrogate and question a lot, because often governance is used as a shorthand for technocratic solutions that take power out of the hands of the people. That essentially there's the unwashed masses cannot be trusted to do the right thing. They elect criminals, they elect unsavory types, they elect people who promise them jobs and televisions and radios. But we know the right way to do things, and if we can get the right governance reforms in, we essentially we'll fix the system, right? There are technical solutions that we can design. We make politics an engineering problem as opposed to a people problem or people question. And this was palpable then. I think it's still palpable now, that a lot of the solutions in which the private sector is increasingly engaged, whether it's e-governance or mobile money, are essentially things that take out of the public domain and privatize things, in which maybe they'll be good, maybe more people will get their lunch, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that democracy is messy, right? And maybe part of the commitment to democracy is that some things don't work very well every so often, and that's okay. So.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I'm thinking that the current slogan, whether that's by the Chinese, they are anti-corruption. In America, you are saying drain the swamp, although they did it or not, there's a big question. In Modi, in India, Modi, I think there has been saying, if you don't like somebody say something that is wrong, stay away from them. So I just wonder, is this a popular concept now? After all, money is always dirty, whether that is in NGO or in two-party or multi-party. And in America, why do you have to name president and vice president as a ticket? And in the state level, you have to have a governor and lieutenant governor as a ticket. Why don't you just appoint somebody who are simply qualified and intelligent, and they have a heart or a public interest rather than following the money? After all, they are following the money. They are being the puppet of the money. And whether the money is steal or rob or anywhere, especially the PPP, public-private partnership, sometimes they P3 is probably the extreme fraudulent criminal network operation. What I mean extreme, they can do everything, including the murder. So I just wonder if our society, I mean, even in the ancient style, in the Robin Hood, you are doing something loyalty and patriotic. But now I don't think we see anything anywhere, these sort of things. So I just wonder, how do you develop this character and public interest? I think that's the most basic. You want to have a good government.
Yeah. I like that question. Look, I think the question of civic education, which was touched on in Section 5, is we're not going to have time to talk about it today, but I encourage those of you who have the report to read that, because I think there's some really deep ideas over there. We have to train young people to think about civic life and commitment to public service much more aggressively than we are. There's this wonderful organization that's starting up outside in Delhi called the Global Education and Leadership Foundation, which is a foundation of someone named Shiv Khemka. But what Shiv and his team have been doing, what T-GELF has been doing, is developing in collaboration with the Teachers College at Columbia and a syllabus to teach young people values of civicness and leadership, right? What it means to be an ethical leader in a society that they're now introducing. And in fact, we at Georgetown, we're doing a little impact analysis for them in high schools, 9th and 10th standard students across the state of Rajasthan, for instance. Right, you'll see whether or not it works. A preliminary analysis that we've done suggests that students who were exposed to this curriculum were making more ethical decisions than those who weren't. So maybe there's hope for that, even if we were to scale it. So I think that's one avenue. We got to actually teach this. But the other that, again, unfortunately, we won't have time to talk about is really to think about the role of the fourth estate, the role of the media, and actually of the judicial institutions, which is missing in this report, right? The rule of law is really the one place I would say is deeply broken in India, right? The Indian judicial system is so weighed down by its lack of capacity and the volume of cases that average court cases take 10, 15 years before resolution, even for fairly simple sorts of things. A system that is that dysfunctional cannot hold anyone else accountable, right? So if politicians break the law, if actors break the law, there's in effect no way, there's no timeline in which they're going to be held accountable that jives with everything else. I think that's where we invest. I would say, to answer your question, there needs to be an investment in education of civics and values, and then I think we need to think really hard about the rule of law and how we bolster it in a way that complements accountability.
Great, thanks. Maybe we have time for one more very brief question, if there is, from the audience, and then I'd like to give our experts just the final say and any closing thoughts. Anyone? Okay.
Sorry, I don't know if this qualifies as a brief question, but Irfan, you raised this issue of scale and democracy, and that to me is stunningly interesting, and yet I had trouble peeling it apart. Because it's whether it's 2.2 million or 1.5 million or 500,000, you're still talking about relationships of accountability that extend well beyond any kind of, in almost every case, well beyond any personal interaction. So how do we begin to think about what the acceptable, optimal, or even viable scale of accountability, representation could be? And how do we combine that with questions of technology or outreach or finance or anything else? I mean, in other words, you seem to have simultaneously a very positive view about kind of India broadly and its democratic system, but then also a kind of a easy dismissal that, well, the Lok Sabha can't and won't probably do much for a long time. So how do we think about just this big scale problem when it comes to the functioning of democracies?
I appreciate the pushback and the challenge on that. It's I think the fundamental question. So let's think about the European Parliament, right? I think we need to start thinking about the Lok Sabha as more parallel to the European Parliament than to the German Bundestag or to the, well, I guess Westminster is no longer relevant to the EU, but, to Westminster. In that, we don't expect yet, anyway, of the EU Parliament as doing substituting for all the functions of the German Parliament or the French Parliament or the Spanish government, right? We expect that that's the level at which the real big decisions are being made. And yes, at the EU stuff, we talk about the interstate management and how we think about this as a common thing. I think that's where the Indian Lok Sabha has to stay for a long time, given the scale issue. That what the Lok Sabha does is essentially manage interstate commerce kind of stuff and manages national security kind of stuff, but stays pretty largely out of the day-to-day kinds of legislation that affects citizens' lives on a regular basis. That is different from, in many ways, the way we typically think of the Lok Sabha, and definitely I think the way the MPs would think about them. But I think the scale stuff is really most problematic at the Lok Sabha level. The moment you get below the Lok Sabha, the average state in India begins to have MLA representation to constituency that looks much more normal, right? Of course, states like Maharashtra or the Uttar Pradesh aren't, because they're large countries within that we call states. Maharashtra is 110 million people, UP is 220 million people, right? But Tripura or Goa or Kerala have ratios that are much more manageable. And the decentralization of the Panchayat Raj and even of bolstering municipalities, municipal corporators, all of that, all bring government closer to citizens. So I think that's one place. I think technology has been already seen in terms of the data journalism that is happening. I think that's one of the most exciting spaces in Indian journalism right now. Organizations like Scroll and India Spend and others that are really using RTI combined with data visualization to put in the hands of citizens performance cards, report cards, audits of how money is being spent and being tracked. But most of that is happening at much lower levels of government than the Lok Sabha. So again, just a shift in focus. And then the final thing I'd say, this is in some ways goes back to my ADL point. Given the scale, it is very hard to imagine any system in which citizens can hold these guys accountable in any real sense of the term, right? You're 1 out of 2.5 million. I mean, that's but that's kind of why the party is so crucial, because the parties can hold their MPs accountable, right? So you described the opacity of nomination processes. We can do more for internal democracy. But at the end of the day, the party is the one organization that can actually hold these guys accountable for doing or not doing their jobs, not individual citizens. So I think it forces a question, and I'm not sure I have a great answer for it, as accountable to whom, and can we have multiple sources of accountability that together combine to create a better system? So in summary, yeah, I'm pessimistic that we'll have any reforms that actually bolster citizen-level accountability of members of the Lok Sabha, but that's not to say they can't be held accountable by the rule of law, by their party organizations. And I think decentralization has been a good thing because for the most part it's brought the locus of power closer to citizens in ways that I think are just pro-democratic.
Great, thanks. I know that the time is somewhat up, but given that you've traveled here today and given of your time, I invite you both to give some parting kind of comments or thoughts for India's future or democratic trends, other things. Sure.
So thank you for once again for inviting us here, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. In terms of India's future, and especially India's future as a democracy, I think I'd pick up on three sort of trends and or places of sort of reflecting in a sober way. So one is, of course, I think the rightly attributed excitement around India's cities. These are essentially archipelagos that are thriving and reflective of a growing Indian middle class, ideas, some of the private sector organizations that we're seeing thriving, entrepreneurship and others. Of course, they represent challenges too of the environment, of infrastructure, and really of accountability, for example, in municipal governments. But I think there's something very exciting happening in India's cities, and that growth, I think, is something worth watching, for good or for bad, along the measure of all the sort of trends that you've highlighted in the report. I think the second one, and it gets often cited, but I'd like to sort of just take a moment to deepen it a little bit, is India's soft power. And by that, I don't just mean in terms of India's projection with regards to its sort of wonderful arts and film industry, literature and academia, etc., but India as a power that is rubbing up against powers in the world who are English-speaking that are withdrawing. And I think India can really step into that space. Yes, it has, hundreds of languages and dialects, but ultimately I think it can step into a space where it can be both a regional leader and a global leader. Its internationalism hasn't waned, even though we've seen some of the similar trends around the world of sort of nativism and globalization, sort of anti-globalization elsewhere. That hasn't gone hand in hand with India's sort of fervent nationalism. There's still an excitement about looking outside. And then the third one, and somewhat related to this, is there's a book that's just come out that's doing all the rounds by Steve Levitsky and Dan Ziblatt on sort of the death of democracy. And the argument essentially gets at the role of norms. Political scientists sort of hate to think about ideas and norms in culture, but we've seen that these facets matter. And there is, I think you mentioned this earlier, about sort of a nativism, a nationalism, a sort of exclusionary them and us. But I think as much as that exists in India with regards to the current government, it is a messy democracy, and I'm not convinced that that's necessarily going to last the pace. I think India sort of dwarfs that kind of nativism, and as long as a check is kept on those kind of norms, then India's democracy survives with all its warts and all. And so, on balance, I'm very hopeful on all those three counts.
I think that's very nicely said, Bilal. I published this book called Elections in Hard Times in the summer of 2016, right? And I opened that with a sort of a comparison between India and Pakistan and the experience of democracy that those two countries have had from effectively the same starting point on the midnight of August 14th into the 15th of 1947. I imagine if I'd written it a year later, it would have all been about Mr. Trump and the events of November 2016. I say that because I think the United States likes to call itself the world's oldest democracy, right? The Senate likes to refer to itself as the greatest deliberative body in the world. The institutional rules that govern committee work, the resources available to it are the envy of organizations around the world. And tomorrow, like I said earlier, we might have a second shutdown in a month because these guys can't talk to each other and get basic things done, including things that are seen as major national priorities. That suggests, in a sense, to echo what Bilal said, that maybe we need to look beyond institutional fixes, right, as the sole source of problems, because even when you have those institutions deeply developed, deeply institutionalized, they can go off the rails almost without us realizing that was coming. So where else might we look? I think really where we would want to look is the role of the media. And again, this report does a very nice job thinking about the challenges of the fragmentation of the media space, and in particular social media, for creating information ecosystems that are challenging for democracy, right? Fake news, in other words, but really more, maybe less fake news than echo chambers in which we all solicit our own sources of news, such that we no longer have a common set of references or legitimacy of sources. And to hold someone accountable at its core is to say, for this action, there shall be a consequence. But if the actions themselves are disputed, right, if was this done, was it not done, was this legitimate, not legitimate, is something that we as a society disagree on, then the premise of accountability falls apart. And so I would say that, for me, is India's biggest challenge. The media landscape right now is deeply troubling and depressing. There are offshoots of really exciting investigative journalism occurring, but the scale of them is simply cannot keep up with the people who have, primetime news stations that reach out to millions and millions of people. And then you have the wonderful thing about India is, of course, you have the vernacular press, which is growing. Actually, it's one of the only countries in the world where newspaper circulation is actually increasing. But that vernacular press is largely outside most of our worldview. We can't read them. We don't know what's going on in them. And so there's a big black box of how most people get their information that I think we need, as researchers, we need to dig into. But thank you again for this invitation. and for this opportunity.
Great. Thank you for your knowledge and time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.